Helena Petrovna Blavatsky stands as the singular figure who transformed Western esotericism from a collection of fragmented traditions into a coherent philosophical system that would influence spiritual thought for generations. Born in 1831 in Ukraine, Blavatsky emerged during a period when Western society was experiencing unprecedented upheaval between religious orthodoxy and scientific materialism. Her unique contribution lay not merely in preserving ancient wisdom traditions, but in synthesizing Eastern and Western esoteric knowledge into a comprehensive worldview that could address the spiritual hunger of the modern age. The founding of the Theosophical Society in New York in 1875, alongside Colonel Henry Steele Olcott and William Quan Judge, marked the beginning of what historians now recognize as the modern esoteric movement. Blavatsky's approach differed radically from previous Western occult traditions, which had remained largely secretive and exclusive. Instead, she advocated for the public dissemination of ancient wisdom, arguing that humanity had reached a stage of development where these teachings could be safely shared with those ready to receive them. Her revolutionary methodology involved combining rigorous scholarly research with claimed direct communication with advanced spiritual beings known as the Masters or Mahatmas. This dual approach satisfied both the intellectual demands of educated Westerners and their yearning for authentic spiritual experience. Blavatsky's writings demonstrated an encyclopedic knowledge of world religions, philosophical systems, and scientific theories, which she wove together into a unified cosmological framework. The impact of her work extended far beyond the Theosophical Society itself, influencing virtually every major esoteric movement that would emerge in the following century. From anthroposophy to the New Age movement, from modern witchcraft to contemporary channeling phenomena, the fingerprints of Blavatsky's revolutionary synthesis can be traced throughout the landscape of modern spirituality. Perhaps Blavatsky's most profound contribution to modern esotericism was her systematic integration of Eastern and Western spiritual traditions at a time when such synthesis was virtually unprecedented in Western thought. Her extensive travels throughout India, Tibet, and other regions of Asia provided her with direct access to Sanskrit texts, Tibetan manuscripts, and oral traditions that had remained largely unknown to Western scholars. This exposure enabled her to present concepts such as karma, reincarnation, and the evolution of consciousness in ways that could be understood and accepted by Western minds. In Isis Unveiled, published in 1877, Blavatsky demonstrated how ancient Egyptian mysteries, Greek philosophy, Hermetic traditions, and Eastern wisdom teachings all pointed toward the same fundamental truths about the nature of reality and human destiny. This comparative approach revealed the underlying unity beneath apparent diversity, suggesting that all authentic spiritual traditions emerged from a single primordial source of wisdom that she termed the ancient wisdom religion. Her presentation of Eastern concepts was particularly revolutionary for Victorian society, which had been largely isolated from Asian philosophical systems. Blavatsky introduced Western audiences to the sophisticated metaphysical frameworks of Hinduism and Buddhism, particularly the concept of cyclical time, the evolution of consciousness through multiple incarnations, and the existence of subtle planes of reality beyond physical perception. These ideas would gradually permeate Western thought, influencing psychology, philosophy, and even scientific theories about consciousness. The synthesis Blavatsky achieved was not merely intellectual, but experiential, as she claimed to have been trained in these traditions by living masters who had preserved the ancient teachings in their purest form. This claimed direct transmission provided her work with an authority that purely academic approaches could not match, appealing to those seeking authentic spiritual guidance rather than mere philosophical speculation. Central to Blavatsky's transformation of modern esotericism was her articulation of what she called the ancient wisdom religion, a primordial source of spiritual knowledge that she claimed had been preserved throughout history by initiated guardians. According to her teachings in The Secret Doctrine, this ancient wisdom formed the foundation of all authentic religious and philosophical systems, though it had become fragmented and distorted through centuries of transmission and interpretation. Blavatsky's presentation of the ancient wisdom differed significantly from previous Western esoteric traditions in its scope and systematic nature. Rather than focusing on specific practices or limited doctrines, she outlined a comprehensive cosmological framework that addressed the fundamental questions of existence: the nature of divinity, the structure of the universe, the purpose of human evolution, and the destiny of consciousness. This framework was built upon what she termed the three fundamental propositions, which described the absolute nature of reality, the cyclical manifestation of universes, and the evolutionary journey of consciousness. The ancient wisdom, as Blavatsky presented it, was not a matter of belief, but of knowledge that could be verified through direct experience by those who developed the necessary faculties of perception. This emphasis on experiential validation appealed to the scientific mentality of her era, while maintaining the transformative power of genuine spiritual teaching. She argued that the same methods of observation and verification used in physical science could be applied to the investigation of subtle phenomena and spiritual realities. Her systematic presentation of these teachings in The Secret Doctrine provided a foundation upon which subsequent esoteric movements could build. The work's detailed exposition of cosmogenesis, anthropogenesis, and the evolution of consciousness offered a comprehensive alternative to both religious dogma and materialistic science, presenting a middle path that honored both spiritual insight and rational inquiry. One of Blavatsky's most influential contributions to modern esotericism was her detailed description of the spiritual hierarchy of evolved beings who guide human development from behind the scenes of ordinary history. The concept of the masters, Mahatmas, or elder brothers represented a revolutionary departure from traditional Western religious concepts of divine intervention, presenting instead a naturalistic understanding of spiritual evolution and guidance. According to Blavatsky's teachings, the masters were human beings who had completed their evolutionary journey on Earth but chose to remain connected to the planet to assist in humanity's spiritual development. These advanced souls, she claimed, maintained physical bodies while possessing consciousness that transcended ordinary human limitations. They communicated with selected individuals through various means, including telepathic transmission, precipitated letters, and direct personal contact in rare cases. The master teaching, as presented in Blavatsky's writings and correspondence, provided a bridge between Eastern guru traditions and Western concepts of spiritual authority. Unlike the divine revelations claimed by traditional religions, the master's guidance was presented as coming from beings who had themselves traversed the path of human evolution, making their wisdom accessible and relevant to contemporary seekers. This democratization of spiritual authority would profoundly influence subsequent esoteric movements. Blavatsky's detailed descriptions of individual masters, particularly Master Moria and Master Kuthumi, provided concrete focal points for spiritual aspiration while maintaining the mystery necessary for genuine esoteric work. The letters received from these masters, published as the Mahatma Letters, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of both spiritual principles and contemporary scientific theories, appealing to intellectually oriented seekers who required evidence of genuine higher knowledge. Under Blavatsky's influence, Western occultism underwent a fundamental transformation from its traditional focus on ceremonial magic and divination to a more philosophical and ethical approach centered on spiritual development and service to humanity. Her teachings emphasize that genuine occult knowledge could only be safely accessed by those who had developed the necessary moral and intellectual qualifications, shifting the focus from the manipulation of external forces to the transformation of consciousness. The theosophical approach to occult development emphasized meditation, study, and selfless service, rather than the ritualistic practices that had dominated Western esoteric traditions. Blavatsky argued that the true mysteries concerned the nature of consciousness itself, and that psychic phenomena, while real, were merely byproducts of spiritual development rather than goals in themselves. This perspective would profoundly influence the approach to spiritual practice in subsequent esoteric movements. Blavatsky's presentation of yoga philosophy and practice to Western audiences marked another crucial transformation in esoteric methodology. She introduced concepts such as the 7 principles of human nature, the chakra system, and various forms of meditation that had been largely unknown in the West. These teachings provided practical methods for spiritual development that could be adapted to Western psychological and cultural conditions. The ethical dimension of Blavatsky's occultism represented a significant departure from previous traditions that often emphasized power and personal advancement. Her insistence that genuine spiritual development required the cultivation of universal compassion and the dedication of one's abilities to the service of humanity established a moral framework that would influence virtually all subsequent Western esoteric movements. Blavatsky's approach to esotericism was revolutionary in its systematic integration of spiritual teachings with contemporary scientific discoveries and theories. Unlike previous esoteric traditions that often stood in opposition to scientific inquiry, she embraced scientific methodology while arguing that its scope needed to be expanded to include the investigation of consciousness and subtle phenomena. This integration would prove crucial for the acceptance of esoteric ideas among educated Western audiences. In The Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky demonstrated remarkable familiarity with the scientific theories of her time, including evolution, geology, astronomy, and emerging understandings of energy and matter. She argued that ancient wisdom teachings anticipated many scientific discoveries and provided a framework for understanding phenomena that purely materialistic science could not adequately explain. This approach suggested that science and spirituality were complementary rather than contradictory ways of exploring reality. Her presentation of the sevenfold nature of matter and consciousness paralleled contemporary scientific investigations into the nature of energy and atomic structure. Blavatsky's descriptions of the etheric plane and subtle energies anticipated later scientific discoveries about electromagnetic fields and quantum phenomena, though her framework extended far beyond purely physical considerations to include the role of consciousness in shaping reality. The scientific integration achieved in Blavatsky's work provided a foundation for the emergence of what would later be called consciousness research and transpersonal psychology. Her insistence that spiritual phenomena could be investigated using modified scientific methods inspired generations of researchers to explore the frontiers between science and spirituality, leading to significant developments in fields such as parapsychology and consciousness studies. Blavatsky's influence on modern esotericism extended significantly into the realm of psychological understanding, as her detailed exposition of human consciousness and its various levels would profoundly impact the development of depth psychology and transpersonal approaches to mental health. Her systematic description of the 7 principles of human nature provided a sophisticated framework for understanding the complexity of consciousness that went far beyond the simple body-mind dualism prevalent in Western thought. Her presentation of the concept of the higher self and lower self offered a psychological model that could account for the apparent contradictions in human behavior and the potential for spiritual transformation. This understanding influenced early psychologists and philosophers who were seeking alternatives to purely materialistic explanations of human nature. The theosophical model of consciousness as operating on multiple levels simultaneously provided a foundation for later developments in transpersonal psychology and consciousness research. Blavatsky's teachings about karma and reincarnation introduced Western audiences to concepts that would revolutionize understanding of human psychology and behavior. The idea that current psychological patterns and tendencies might be rooted in experiences from previous incarnations offered new perspectives on mental illness, personality disorders, and the process of psychological healing. These concepts would later influence the development of past life therapy and other alternative approaches to psychological treatment. Her emphasis on the evolutionary nature of consciousness and the possibility of accelerated spiritual development through disciplined practice provided a framework for understanding human potential that extended far beyond conventional psychological models. This perspective would influence humanistic and transpersonal psychology movements that emphasized growth, self-actualization, and the exploration of expanded states of consciousness. The literary influence of Helena Blavatsky on modern esotericism cannot be overstated, as her voluminous writings established the vocabulary, concepts, and literary style that would characterize esoteric literature for generations to come. Her major works, particularly Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine, demonstrated that esoteric teachings could be presented with scholarly rigor and encyclopedic scope, elevating the intellectual respectability of occult subjects in Western culture. Blavatsky's writing style, which combined extensive quotations from ancient texts with contemporary commentary and analysis, established a new genre of esoteric literature that would be widely emulated. Her ability to weave together diverse source materials from different cultures and time periods into coherent philosophical arguments demonstrated the underlying unity of esoteric traditions while making them accessible to modern readers. This synthetic approach would become a hallmark of subsequent esoteric writing. The cultural impact of her work extended far beyond specifically esoteric circles, influencing literature, art, and popular culture in ways that continue to resonate today. Writers such as W.B. Yeats, James Joyce, and T.S. Eliot drew upon theosophical concepts in their work, while artists like Wassily Kandinsky and Piet Mondrian acknowledged the influence of theosophical teachings on their artistic development. This cultural penetration helped normalize esoteric concepts in mainstream Western thought. Her introduction of Sanskrit terms and Eastern philosophical concepts into Western discourse created a new vocabulary for discussing spiritual and metaphysical subjects. Terms such as karma, dharma, astral body, and akashic records became part of the common lexicon of Western esotericism, providing precise language for concepts that had previously lacked adequate expression in European languages. The organizational structures and methodologies established by Blavatsky through the Theosophical Society would profoundly influence how esoteric knowledge was disseminated and spiritual communities were organized throughout the modern era. Her vision of an international brotherhood of seekers dedicated to the study of comparative religion, philosophy, and science created a new model for spiritual organizations that balanced democratic participation with hierarchical guidance based on knowledge and experience. The Theosophical Society's emphasis on education and public outreach represented a radical departure from the secretive nature of traditional esoteric societies. Blavatsky argued that the time had come for ancient wisdom to be made available to all sincere seekers, regardless of their social status, religious background, or cultural origin. This democratic approach to esoteric knowledge would influence virtually all subsequent spiritual movements in the West. The Society's organizational structure, with its combination of local lodges and international coordination, provided a model that would be adopted by numerous other esoteric organizations. The emphasis on study groups, public lectures, and the publication of literature created effective methods for spreading esoteric ideas that balanced serious study with accessibility to newcomers. This approach maximized the impact of the teachings while maintaining their integrity and depth. Blavatsky's insistence on the importance of personal verification of teachings rather than blind acceptance of authority established a culture of intelligent inquiry within esoteric circles that would distinguish modern esotericism from both religious dogmatism and skeptical materialism. This balance between respect for traditional wisdom and individual spiritual autonomy would become a defining characteristic of Western esoteric movements. Helena Blavatsky's role as a female spiritual teacher and philosopher in the late 19th century represented a revolutionary challenge to the male-dominated religious and philosophical establishments of her time. Her emergence as a recognized authority on spiritual matters helped pave the way for women's participation in esoteric and religious leadership roles, contributing to the broader transformation of gender relationships within spiritual communities. Her teachings emphasize the fundamental equality of male and female principles in both cosmic and human evolution, presenting a balanced view of gender that differed significantly from the patriarchal perspectives dominant in both Eastern and Western religious traditions. Blavatsky's exposition of the divine feminine principle and the role of female deities in various mythological systems provided theological support for women's spiritual authority and leadership. The personal example of her own life as a woman who traveled independently, challenged social conventions, and claimed direct access to spiritual knowledge, inspired generations of women to pursue their own spiritual development without conforming to traditional gender roles. Her success in establishing herself as a credible spiritual teacher opened possibilities for other women to assume similar roles within esoteric communities. The Theosophical Society's acceptance of women in leadership positions, including Annie Besant's succession to the presidency after Blavatsky's death, established precedents for female spiritual authority that would influence other esoteric organizations. This inclusivity contributed to the attraction of the movement for intellectually oriented women who found limited opportunities for spiritual and philosophical expression in conventional religious institutions. Under Blavatsky's influence, Western esotericism transformed from a primarily European phenomenon into a truly global movement that facilitated unprecedented exchanges between different spiritual traditions. Her extensive travels and study in Asia established direct connections between Western seekers and Eastern teachers, creating networks of communication and influence that would continue to develop long after her death. The establishment of theosophical centers in India, Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and other Asian countries created institutional frameworks for ongoing dialogue between Eastern and Western spiritual traditions. These centers served not only as bases for Western students seeking to learn from Asian teachers, but also as meeting places where Asian practitioners could encounter Western interpretations of their own traditions, leading to mutual enrichment and evolution of understanding. Blavatsky's influence on the Hindu Renaissance and Buddhist revival movements in Asia demonstrates the reciprocal nature of her cultural impact. Her presentations of Hindu and Buddhist philosophy to Western audiences helped Asian intellectuals and spiritual leaders recognize the value of their own traditions in the face of Western cultural dominance. This recognition contributed to movements of cultural and spiritual renewal that had lasting effects on Asian societies. The global network of correspondence and communication, established through the Theosophical Society, created new possibilities for the international exchange of esoteric ideas and practices. This network facilitated the emergence of a truly international esoteric community that transcended national cultural and religious boundaries, establishing patterns of global spiritual communication that would continue to develop through subsequent technological advances. The intellectual framework established by Blavatsky's systematic presentation of esoteric philosophy would profoundly influence the development of alternative approaches to science and philosophy throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Her integration of spiritual and scientific perspectives provided a foundation for the emergence of fields such as transpersonal psychology, consciousness research, and holistic approaches to health and healing that continue to develop today. Her detailed exposition of the correspondence between microcosm and macrocosm, the sevenfold nature of manifestation, and the cyclical patterns governing both cosmic and human evolution provided conceptual frameworks that would influence thinkers in diverse fields. These principles offered alternatives to purely mechanistic worldviews while maintaining compatibility with scientific methodology and rational inquiry. The theosophical emphasis on direct experience and personal verification of spiritual teachings established methodological approaches that would influence the development of experiential psychology and consciousness research. Blavatsky's insistence that spiritual phenomena could be investigated using disciplined observation and analysis provided a bridge between subjective spiritual experience and objective scientific inquiry. Her comprehensive cosmological vision, encompassing both the evolution of matter and consciousness across vast cycles of time, anticipated later developments in evolutionary theory, systems thinking, and complexity science. The integration of purpose and intelligence into natural processes offered alternatives to purely random evolutionary models, while maintaining scientific rigor and empirical grounding. Helena Blavatsky's transformation of Western esotericism continues to shape contemporary spiritual movements and alternative approaches to religion, philosophy, and science more than a century after her death. The New Age movement, with its emphasis on personal spiritual development, the synthesis of Eastern and Western traditions, and the integration of spiritual and scientific perspectives, bears the clear imprint of theosophical influences established by Blavatsky's pioneering work. Contemporary channeling phenomena, crystal healing, chakra work, and other popular spiritual practices can trace their theoretical foundations to concepts first systematically presented to Western audiences through Blavatsky's writings. Her introduction of Sanskrit terminology and Eastern philosophical frameworks provided the vocabulary and conceptual tools that continue to be used in modern spiritual discourse, from meditation centers to holistic healing practices. The influence of her work extends into academic fields as well, as scholars in religious studies, philosophy, and consciousness research continue to grapple with questions she raised about the nature of spiritual experience, the relationship between science and spirituality, and the possibility of human evolution beyond current physical and mental limitations. Universities now offer courses in subjects that were first systematically explored in her writings. Perhaps most significantly, Blavatsky's vision of universal brotherhood and the underlying unity of all spiritual traditions continues to influence contemporary efforts to build bridges between different religious and cultural communities. Her demonstration that apparently divergent spiritual paths share common origins and destinations provides intellectual and philosophical foundations for interfaith dialogue and cooperation that remain relevant in our increasingly interconnected global civilization. The transformation of esotericism that she initiated continues to unfold as humanity seeks to integrate ancient wisdom with modern understanding in response to contemporary challenges and opportunities.